deep in the Oregon wilderness, where ancient pines cast shadows that never lift. 19-year-old Ilara clutched her father's debt notice with trembling fingers. The man standing before her, Thomas Creek, the town's reclusive forest ranger, had just paid off everything her family owed, but the price was her hand in marriage. Everyone whispered he was odd, living alone among the trees for 15 years, speaking more to ravens than people. What they didn't know was that Ilara had been watching him from her bedroom window since she was 12, sketching his every movement in secret journals hidden beneath her floorboards. She'd seen things that defied explanation, lights dancing through his cabin windows at midnight, animals gathering in perfect circles around his home, and most mysteriously, his hands glowing faintly whenever he touched wounded creatures. Now, as the entire town gathered for their wedding, Thomas presented her with a gift that made the crowd gasp in wonder. A miniature treehouse so intricate, so impossibly detailed, that it seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. But why did it look exactly like the recurring dreams that had haunted her since childhood? The delicate structure rested in Thomas's weathered palms, no larger than a jewelry box, yet every tiny plank of wood bore the marks of careful craftsmanship. Miniature rope bridges swayed between levels, carved leaves adorned minuscule railings, and windows no bigger than dewdrops reflected the afternoon sun. The townspeople pressed closer, their hushed voices carrying notes of awe and unease. "How long must that have taken him?" whispered Mrs. Henderson, the baker's wife. "Look at those stairs," breathed Mayor Collins. "Each step is perfectly formed. I can barely see them without my spectacles." Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs as she stared at the gift. In her dreams, she had climbed those exact stairs countless times, her bare feet finding purchase on wood that felt warm and alive beneath her touch. She had gazed out those precise windows at a forest that stretched beyond the horizon, filled with creatures that spoke in languages older than human memory. The dreams always ended the same way, with her standing on the highest platform, calling out to someone she could never quite see, someone whose voice answered from the darkness between the trees. "Do you like it?" Thomas's voice was barely above a whisper, meant only for her ears. Up close she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the silver threading through his dark hair, the careful way he held himself as if always listening for something the rest of them couldn't hear. She wanted to ask him how he knew, how he could have crafted something so perfectly aligned with her most private visions. Instead, she managed a small nod, her throat too tight for words. Pastor Williams cleared his throat, drawing their attention back to the ceremony. The wedding was taking place in the town square rather than the church, Thomas had insisted, claiming he felt more comfortable under open sky. Ilara suspected there were other reasons, ones connected to the way shadows seemed to bend around him, even in broad daylight. "Shall we continue?" the pastor prompted, though his eyes kept drifting to the miniature treehouse with obvious fascination. Thomas nodded and carefully placed the gift on a nearby table, where it caught the light in ways that made Ilara's vision blur. For just a moment she could have sworn she saw movement in those tiny windows, a flicker of warmth, as if someone lived within those impossible walls. Her father, Robert, stepped forward with obvious relief painting his weathered features. The debt that had threatened to crush their family was gone, erased by this strange man's generosity. Her mother dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, though whether from joy or sorrow, Ilara couldn't tell. "Dearly beloved," Pastor Williams began, but his words seemed to come from a great distance. Ilara found herself studying Thomas's hands as he reached for hers, those hands that she had seen glow in the darkness, that had coaxed injured foxes back to health and convinced territorial bears to move along without violence. Now they were warm and steady against her cold fingers, calloused from years of outdoor work, yet gentle enough to create something as delicate as the gift that waited nearby. "Do you, Thomas Creek, take Ilara to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do." His answer was firm, his green eyes never leaving her face. "And do you, Ilara Morrison, take Thomas to be your lawfully wedded husband?" The words caught in her throat. This wasn't how she had imagined her wedding day, bound by debt rather than love, surrounded by curious strangers rather than celebrating friends. But as she looked into Thomas's eyes, she saw something unexpected there. Not pity or obligation, but a recognition that made her breath catch, as if he too had been dreaming of someone he couldn't quite see. "I do," she whispered. The pastor's blessing washed over them, but Ilara barely heard the words. Her gaze kept drifting to the miniature treehouse, where afternoon shadows played across its tiny surfaces like memories made manifest. The morning after her wedding, Clara woke to silence so complete it felt like being wrapped in cotton. No street vendors calling their wares, no clip-clop of horses on cobblestones, no neighbors arguing through thin tenement walls. Just the whisper of wind through pine needles and the distant call of a hawk circling somewhere above the canopy. She dressed quickly, in one of the 3 simple dresses she'd been allowed to pack, her fingers trembling as she worked the buttons. The cottage was still and empty when she emerged from the small bedroom. Their bedroom, she reminded herself with a flutter of anxiety, though Marcus had wordlessly taken the worn quilt and pillow to sleep on the narrow couch in the main room, leaving her the bed with its clean white sheets and scratchy wool blanket. The handcrafted treehouse sat on the kitchen table where she'd left it, looking almost ordinary in the pale morning light filtering through gingham curtains. Clara approached it cautiously, as if it might sprout wings and fly away. In daylight, she could see details that had escaped her notice the night before. Tiny hinges on the miniature door, carved shutters that actually opened and closed, even a minuscule weather vane shaped like a running deer perched on the peaked roof. She knelt beside the table, bringing her face level with the impossibly perfect creation. The door stood slightly ajar, and she could swear she glimpsed something glinting in the shadowed interior. With one finger she pushed it open wider. Inside, the craftsmanship was even more extraordinary. Miniature furniture filled the single room, a table no bigger than a thimble, chairs that could have been made for dolls, a fireplace with a mantel adorned with objects too small to identify clearly. But it was what sat in the center of the tiny table that made Clara's breath catch. A ring. Not full-sized, but not quite small enough to belong in a dollhouse either. It was carved from some kind of dark wood, so perfectly formed it looked like it had been turned on a lathe designed for sprites. Strange symbols were etched around the band, symbols that seemed to shift and change when she wasn't looking directly at them. "You found it." Clara spun around, her heart hammering. Marcus stood in the doorway, his dark hair damp with morning mist and his clothes smelling of pine sap and earth. In the daylight, she could see him more clearly than she had at their awkward wedding ceremony. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps only a few years older than her own 22, with calloused hands and watchful green eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. "I'm sorry," she stammered. "I didn't mean to pry. I was just looking—" "It's yours," he said simply, moving to the stove and beginning to build up the banked fire. "I made it for you. The whole treehouse, the ring." He glanced over his shoulder at her. "Though the treehouse too, I suppose." Clara looked back at the impossibly small ring. How is it even possible to carve something so detailed at that size?" Marcus was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, measured. "I have steady hands." It wasn't really an answer, and they both knew it. Clara reached into the treehouse and carefully lifted out the tiny ring. The moment her fingers touched it, warmth spread up her arm. Not the natural warmth of wood that had been sitting in sunlight, but something else entirely. Something that made her skin tingle and her pulse quicken. "What kind of wood is this?" she asked. "Old oak, from the deep forest. It feels—" She struggled for the right word. "Alive." Marcus turned from the stove, a strange expression crossing his face. "Does it?" The way he said it, not surprised but almost hopeful, sent a shiver down Clara's spine. She set the ring carefully back in its place and closed the treehouse door. "Who are you really?" "I'm exactly who everyone says I am. A forest ranger, a man who knows trees better than people." "That's not an answer. It's the only answer I can give you right now." Clara studied his face. searching for any hint of deception. But his expression was as unreadable as the forest itself, peaceful on the surface, but hiding depths she couldn't begin to fathom. "Will you show me the forest today?" she asked finally. Something shifted in his eyes, surprise perhaps, or relief. "You want to see it? I want to understand where I am, what my life is going to be like here." Marcus nodded slowly. "Finish your breakfast first. The forest can be overwhelming for those who aren't prepared." As Clara moved to help him prepare their simple meal of eggs and toast, she couldn't shake the feeling that his warning meant something far more significant than she realized. And when she glanced back at the treehouse, she could have sworn the tiny ring was glowing with its own inner light. The morning light filtered through unfamiliar curtains, casting strange shadows across a room that still felt like a dream, or perhaps a beautifully crafted nightmare. Alara sat at the edge of the narrow bed, her wedding dress from yesterday draped over a wooden chair like a ghost of decisions she'd had no part in making. The miniature treehouse rested on the small table beside the window, its intricate details somehow even more bewildering in daylight. She could hear movement downstairs, the soft thud of boots on wooden floors, the gentle clink of dishes. Her husband, preparing breakfast in a kitchen she'd never seen, in a house that was now supposed to be her home. The thought made her stomach twist with anxiety and something else she couldn't quite name. Dressing quickly in one of the simple dresses she'd packed, Ilara picked up the treehouse again. In morning light, new details emerged that she'd missed in yesterday's candlelit examination. Tiny books lined impossibly small shelves, their spines decorated with symbols she didn't recognize. A miniature telescope no larger than a grain of rice pointed through one of the windows. Most unsettling of all, a small figure stood on the treehouse's deck, a carved woman with long hair, wearing a dress remarkably similar to the one Ilara now wore. Her breath caught. The resemblance was too specific to be coincidence. Footsteps on the stairs interrupted her examination. A gentle knock preceded Thomas's voice through the door. "Breakfast is ready if you'd like some." She set the treehouse down carefully. "I'll be right there. I hope you slept well," he said without turning around, as if he could sense her presence. Well enough. She hovered near the doorway, unsure of the protocols of this strange new life. The bed was comfortable. He glanced over his shoulder, offering a small smile. "Good. I know this is all quite an adjustment." The kitchen was clearly his domain. Herbs hung drying from the rafters, and the shelves held an array of jars filled with things she couldn't identify. Some contained what looked like pressed flowers, others held dried roots or mysterious powders. It was the kitchen of someone who knew the forest's secrets, though it felt more like an apothecary than a simple woodsman's workspace. Thomas placed a plate before her. Eggs, fresh bread, and what appeared to be wild berries she'd never seen before. The berries were a deep purple, almost black, and seemed to shimmer slightly in the morning light. "What are these?" she asked, gesturing to the berries. "Shadowberries. They grow deep in the forest, in places where the canopy blocks almost all sunlight. Most people have never seen them." He poured coffee into a simple ceramic mug. "They're perfectly safe, and quite sweet." She took a cautious bite. The flavor was unlike anything she'd ever tasted, rich and complex, with hints of honey and something earthy she couldn't place. "They're wonderful. How do you find them?" "I know the forest well." He sat across from her with his own plate. "I've spent most of my life learning its secrets." The casual way he said secrets made her think of the treehouse upstairs. "About your wedding gift," she began carefully. Thomas's hand paused halfway to his coffee cup. "Yes? The craftsmanship is extraordinary. The detail work, I've never seen anything like it." She studied his face for any reaction. "Where did you learn to create something so intricate?" "I've always been good with my hands," he said, but there was something guarded in his expression now. "Working in the forest, you learn to see details others miss. You develop patience for small things." The figure inside, she pressed gently. "The woman on the deck, she looks remarkably like you." His dark eyes met hers directly for the first time since she'd entered the kitchen. Yes, I know. The admission hung between them like morning mist. Ilara felt her pulse quicken. But we'd never met before yesterday. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup slowly in his hands. No, he said finally, we hadn't met. The weight of his unspoken words filled the kitchen. Ilara found herself leaning forward slightly, as if proximity might help her understand the puzzle he represented. Then how? Instead of answering, he stood and walked to one of the windows overlooking the forest. The woods see many things, Ilara. Sometimes they share what they've seen with those who know how to listen. She stared at his profile, silhouetted against the green darkness of the trees beyond. His words should have sounded like madness, but something in his tone, serious, matter-of-fact, made them feel like a truth she wasn't yet ready to comprehend. What exactly are you saying? When he turned back to her, his expression was gentle but resolute. I'm saying that perhaps our marriage wasn't quite as arranged as everyone believes. The morning light filtered through unfamiliar curtains as Elena woke to the sound of wood being chopped somewhere outside. For a moment, she forgot where she was. Then the events of yesterday crashed back like cold water. The wedding, the strange little treehouse, her new husband who had disappeared before she could ask him about the impossible mechanisms hidden within his gift. She dressed quickly in one of the simple dresses her mother had packed, then made her way to the kitchen. Through the window she could see Marcus splitting logs with methodical precision, his movements efficient and practiced. There was something almost meditative about the way he worked, as if the repetitive motion brought him peace. A covered plate sat on the kitchen table with a note written in careful script, gone to check the north boundary. Back by evening. There's bread in the pantry and preserves in the cellar. Elena ate the simple breakfast he'd prepared, eggs and bacon still warm, while studying the cabin's interior in daylight. Everything was handcrafted, from the smooth-planed wooden counters to the intricate joinery of the cabinets. No nails were visible anywhere, every piece fit together with the precision of a master craftsman. It reminded her of the treehouse, that same attention to detail and impossible perfection. After breakfast, she explored the cabin more thoroughly. The main room served as both kitchen and sitting area, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall. A ladder led to a small loft that Marcus clearly used as sleeping quarters, though where she was meant to sleep remained unclear. They hadn't discussed such arrangements, and she found herself grateful for his absence while she figured out this strange new life. The cabin's walls were lined with bookshelves, and Elena ran her fingers along the spines with growing amazement. Technical manuals on engineering and physics sat beside volumes of poetry. Detailed texts on metallurgy neighbored collections of folk tales. There were books in languages she couldn't identify, their leather bindings worn smooth with use. She pulled out a slim volume titled Mechanical Principles of Miniature Construction and flipped through pages filled with detailed diagrams. Gears, springs, pulleys, all drawn with the same precise hand that had written this morning's note. In the margins, someone had made notes in that familiar script, calculations and observations that meant nothing to her but suggested deep understanding. A sound from outside made her freeze. Footsteps on the porch, too light to be Marcus returning. Elena quickly replaced the book and moved to the window. A woman stood on the porch, elderly but spry, with silver hair braided down her back. She wore practical clothes and carried a basket covered with a checked cloth. When she knocked, Elena hesitated before opening the door. "You must be the new Mrs. Thorne," the woman said with a warm smile. "I'm Mabel Crawford. I live about 2 miles east. Thought I'd bring you some welcome gifts." Elena accepted the basket gratefully, catching the scent of fresh bread and something sweet. "Thank you. That's very kind. May I come in? I imagine you have questions about this place, about Marcus." Elena stepped aside, desperate for information about her enigmatic husband. Mabel settled herself at the kitchen table with the ease of someone familiar with the cabin. "He's a good man," Mabel said without preamble. "Quiet, keeps to himself mostly, but good. Been living here about 5 years now. Showed up one day looking like he'd been through hell, and old Ranger Peterson took him on as assistant. When Peterson retired, Marcus just naturally took over. Where did he come from? Elena asked, pouring tea from the pot that had been warming on the stove. Never said. Some folks in town have theories, think he might be running from something, maybe the law, but I don't buy it. Man who cares for the forest like he does, who builds furniture for widows and fixes broken tools without being asked. That's not a man running from trouble, that's a man running towards something better. Elena thought of the intricate mechanisms in the treehouse. What did he do before he became a ranger? Mabel's eyes sharpened. Now that's the question, isn't it? Whatever it was, he was educated, real educated. Sometimes I catch him looking at things, machines mostly, like he understands them in ways the rest of us don't. And those hands of his can build anything. Has he ever... Elena struggled with how to phrase it. Has he ever made things that seem impossible? Impossible how? Before Elena could answer, they heard boots on the porch. Marcus appeared in the doorway, stopping short when he saw Mabel. Mrs. Crawford, Marcus, just welcoming your bride, bringing her some necessities. His eyes found Elena's, and she saw something flicker there, wariness, perhaps even fear. As if he were afraid of what Mabel might have told her or what she might have asked. That's kind of you, he said carefully. The three of them sat in awkward silence until Mabel rose to leave. As Elena walked her to the door, the older woman squeezed her hand. Give him time, dear. Whatever secrets he's carrying, they're not dark ones. The morning sun filtered through the cabin's windows as Elena sat at the kitchen table, the miniature treehouse positioned carefully before her. She'd barely slept, her mind churning with questions about the impossible mechanisms hidden within its delicate walls. Thomas had left before dawn for his patrol, mentioning something about checking the northern boundary markers, and she was grateful for the solitude. With trembling fingers, she activated the tiny lever again. The pulleys whirred to life, and the minuscule bucket descended on its gossamer thread. This time, instead of the mysterious scroll, she found a piece of bark no larger than her thumbnail, covered in symbols that looked almost like coordinates? Elena squinted at the markings, trying to decipher their meaning. The symbols were etched with incredible precision, each line deliberate and measured. She reached for Thomas's magnifying glass, the one he used for examining plant specimens, and held it over the bark fragment. Her breath caught. These weren't random marks. They were definitely coordinates, but written in a notation system she didn't recognize. Below them, in script so tiny it was barely visible even with the magnifying glass, were the words, "When the moon wanes, follow the cardinal's call." A chill ran down her spine. What kind of woodsman crafted such intricate puzzles? And more importantly, what was he hiding? The sound of hoofbeats approaching made her quickly close the treehouse's door and slide it behind the sugar bowl. Through the window, she watched Thomas dismount from his horse, his expression troubled. He moved with an urgency she hadn't seen before, his usual measured pace replaced by something that bordered on anxiety. "Elena?" he called as he entered, his voice strained. "In the kitchen," she replied, forcing her voice to remain steady. Thomas appeared in the doorway, his dark hair disheveled and a thin line of perspiration beading his brow despite the cool morning air. His eyes immediately went to the table where she sat, scanning it briefly before meeting her gaze. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." His voice carried an edge she'd never heard before. "Have you noticed anyone watching the cabin? Anyone who seemed out of place in the forest?" Elena's heart began to race. "No, Why? What's wrong?" Thomas ran a hand through his hair, leaving it even more disheveled. "Someone's been on the property. Last night, probably while we slept. I found tracks this morning near the edge of the clearing. Boot prints that don't match any of the regular visitors to this area. Could it have been another ranger? Or maybe someone from town?" Thomas moved to the window, his eyes scanning the tree line with the intensity of a predator. These prints were made by someone trying to stay hidden. They approached from the east, circled the cabin twice, and then disappeared back into the forest without a trace. Whoever it was, they're skilled at moving unseen. Elena felt the blood drain from her face. "Do you think they were trying to break in?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working as if he were weighing his words carefully. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I think they were looking for something specific. What could they possibly want from us? We have nothing of value." The look Thomas gave her was so intense, so loaded with meaning, that Elena felt as though he could see straight through to her soul. "Perhaps they think we do." He moved away from the window and sat across from her at the table, his large hands folded in front of him. Elena was acutely aware of the miniature treehouse hidden just inches away, its secrets burning like a brand against her consciousness. "Elena, there are things about my work that I haven't explained to you, things that might put us both in danger." Thomas's voice was steady, but she could see the conflict in his eyes. "I've tried to keep you separate from that part of my life, but it seems that may no longer be possible." "What kind of things?" Elena asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "The Forest Service work is real, but it's not the only work I do. There are other responsibilities I have, commitments I made long before we married." He reached across the table and took her hand, his calloused palm warm against her skin. "I never wanted to involve you in this, but if someone is watching us, you need to understand what you might be facing." Elena stared at their joined hands, her mind reeling. The mysterious treehouse, the cryptic messages, the sophisticated mechanical knowledge required to create such intricate devices. It all suddenly made terrible sense. Her husband wasn't just keeping secrets. He was living an entirely different life than the one he'd presented to the world. "Tell me," she whispered, meeting his eyes with a courage she didn't know she possessed. "Tell me everything." Thomas studied her face for a long moment, as if trying to gauge whether she could handle the truth he was about to reveal. The morning light filtered through the cabin's thick-paned windows, casting dancing shadows across the wooden floors as Elena sat at the kitchen table, the miniature treehouse before her like a puzzle demanding to be solved. She'd barely slept, her mind churning with questions about the impossible mechanisms hidden within its delicate walls. Marcus moved quietly around the kitchen, preparing what smelled like fresh coffee and something involving eggs. The domestic normalcy felt surreal after the revelations of the previous evening. Every few moments, she caught him glancing her way, as if gauging her reaction to everything she'd witnessed. "The gears," she said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. "Where did you learn to make something so intricate?" His hand stilled on the coffee pot. "My grandfather was a clockmaker in the old country. Before the wars changed everything, he poured the dark liquid into two mismatched mugs. He taught me that the most beautiful mechanisms are the ones that serve a purpose beyond mere function." Elena accepted the coffee gratefully, inhaling the rich aroma. "And what purpose does this serve?" She gestured to the treehouse. "That depends on what you choose to see in it." The cryptic answer frustrated her, but before she could press further, a sharp knock echoed through the cabin. Marcus tensed immediately, his entire demeanor shifting from gentle husband to something far more alert and dangerous. "Stay here," he murmured. But Elena was already rising from her chair. "I'm not some delicate flower, Marcus. If there's danger, there's always danger." The words came out harsher than intended, and she saw him immediately regret the tone. "Please, Elena, until we know who it is." Through the window, she glimpsed a figure in a dark coat approaching the front door. Marcus moved to answer it, but kept his body positioned protectively between Elena and whoever waited outside. The door opened to reveal a woman Elena didn't recognize, tall, sharp-featured, with silver-streaked hair pulled back severely and eyes that missed nothing. Her gaze swept past Marcus to land directly on Elena, and something cold crawled up her spine. "Mrs. Kovac," Marcus said carefully, "this is unexpected." "Is it?" The woman's accent carried hints of the same old-world inflection Elena had noticed in Marcus's speech when he was emotional. "May I come in? We have much to discuss." Marcus hesitated, then stepped aside. Mrs. Kovac entered with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, her attention immediately drawn to the treehouse still sitting on the kitchen table. Ah, she said softly. So you've shown her already. How precipitous of you. Elena is my wife, Marcus replied, steel underlying his quiet words. She has a right to know. Does she? Mrs. Kovac approached the table, her fingers hovering over the miniature structure without quite touching it. Rights are earned, young man, not simply granted through marriage vows. Elena's temper flared. I'm standing right here. If you have something to say about me, say it to my face. The older woman's sharp gaze fixed on her with what might have been approval. Spirit. Good, you'll need it. She pulled out a chair without invitation and seated herself. Tell me, my dear, what do you think your husband does in those long hours when he disappears into the forest? He's a ranger. He manages the preserve. And what exactly do you think needs managing in those particular woods? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Elena looked between Marcus and Mrs. Kovac, sensing undercurrents she couldn't quite grasp. Wildlife, trails, whatever rangers typically manage. Mrs. Kovac's smile held no warmth. How refreshingly naive. Marcus, you've told her nothing of substance, haven't you? I've told her what she needs to know for now, he replied carefully. For now, Elena's voice rose. What does that mean? I'm tired of riddles and half-truths. If there's something about my husband I should know. Your husband, Mrs. Kovac interrupted, is one of the last guardians of something far more important than trees and hiking trails. Those woods hold secrets that certain people would kill for, and now, by marriage, you're part of that legacy whether you understand it or not. Elena's coffee cup rattled against the saucer as she set it down with trembling hands. Guardians of what? Marcus moved closer to her, his presence both protective and apologetic. There are things in this world that don't fit into neat categories, Elena. Ancient things, powerful things. The preserve isn't just about conservation, it's about containment. Containment? Before anyone could answer, the treehouse began to emit that soft, melodious chiming again. But this time, the sound held an urgency that made all three adults freeze. Mrs. Kovac rose swiftly from her chair. It seems, she said grimly, that your education will have to be accelerated. Something has triggered the early warning system. She looked directly at Elena. I hope you're prepared to learn just how deep your husband's secrets truly run. Outside, the forest had fallen completely silent. The treehouse had become her sanctuary over the past week, though Elara couldn't shake the feeling that it was changing. Not in obvious ways. The tiny furniture remained perfectly arranged, the miniature books still lined their shelves, but something felt different each time she peered through the windows, as if the dollhouse existed in its own time, separate from hers. Thomas had been absent for 3 days, called away on ranger business according to Mrs. Henley, who delivered meals with increasing curiosity about Elara's newfound fascination with what she called that peculiar little thing. Elara offered vague explanations about admiring the craftsmanship, but she caught the older woman studying her with knowing eyes. On the 4th morning of Thomas's absence, Elara discovered she wasn't alone in her interest in the treehouse. She'd risen early, drawn by restless energy, and found a figure standing in the garden below her window. A woman with silver hair braided down her back, wearing clothes that seemed to belong to another era. A deep green dress with intricate embroidery and a woolen cloak, despite the warm morning. The stranger stood perfectly still, her gaze fixed on Elara's window. When their eyes met, the woman smiled and raised one hand in greeting before turning and disappearing into the forest with fluid, almost otherworldly grace. Elara's hands trembled as she reached for the treehouse. The moment her fingers touched the bark-textured walls, the world shifted. The sensation was becoming familiar now, that feeling of falling upward, of her consciousness stretching beyond the confines of her body. But this time, she wasn't alone in the miniature rooms. The silver-haired woman sat at the tiny dining table, no longer miniature but human-sized in this impossible space. Up close, her ageless face held the same gentle intensity Elara had glimpsed in Thomas's eyes, and her smile carried secrets that seemed older than the forest itself. "You're wondering who I am," the woman said, her voice carrying the musical quality of wind through leaves. I'm Vera Thomas's aunt, though family relationships are complicated in our line. Your line? Ilara found her voice, though everything about this encounter defied reason. Guardians, protectors, people who exist between worlds. Vera gestured to the impossible room around them. Thomas never wanted this responsibility. He hoped for a simple life, but some gifts and some duties cannot be abandoned. Ilara sank into the chair across from Vera, her mind reeling. The arranged marriage, my father's debts. None of it was coincidence. Your father's gambling brought him to dangerous people. People who would have used you to access something they don't understand. Vera's expression grew serious. Thomas intervened, but marriage was the only way to offer you protection without raising suspicion. He couldn't simply explain what he guards, what he protects. What does he protect? Vera stood and moved to one of the tiny windows. Through it, Ilara could see not her bedroom, but an endless expanse of forest that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. Passages, doorways between what most people consider reality and what lies beyond it. This forest has always been a crossing point, and Thomas's family has been its guardians for generations. And the treehouse? A training ground, a safe space where those with the right sensitivity can learn to navigate between worlds without losing themselves. Vera turned back to Ilara. You have that sensitivity. Thomas recognized it immediately, though I suspect you've always felt different, always sensed there was more to the world than what others see. Ilara thought of her childhood, of the imaginary friends adults insisted she'd outgrown, of dreams that felt more real than waking life, of always feeling like she was searching for something she couldn't name. The people my father owed money to, they know about this? They know enough to be dangerous. They seek to exploit the crossing points for power, to control forces they don't understand. Thomas's intervention saved you from becoming their unwilling tool, but it also marked you. They won't give up easily. The weight of revelation pressed down on Ilara. Her entire life had been reshaped by forces beyond her understanding, her future determined by supernatural politics she'd never known existed. Yet beneath the fear, she felt something else, recognition. As if pieces of herself she'd never understood were finally clicking into place. What happens now? She asked. Now you choose, Vera said softly. Thomas hoped to ease you into this knowledge gradually, to let you decide how much you wanted to know. But circumstances are accelerating. You can return to your ordinary life, accept the protection of marriage without delving deeper into what it means. Or you can embrace what you're capable of becoming. Before Ilara could respond, the treehouse shimmered around her. Vera's form began to fade, her final words echoing as the miniature world dissolved. He's returning tonight. Whatever you decide, know that he never meant to trap you, only to offer you a choice you'd never had before. Ilara found herself back in her bedroom, hands still resting on the treehouse, heart pounding with possibility and terror in equal measure. The morning after discovering the shifting room, Elena woke to find Thomas's side of the bed cold and empty. Sunlight filtered through the cabin windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floors, but there was no sign of her husband anywhere inside. Elena's fingers found the tiny golden key hanging around her neck. After what she'd witnessed in the miniature room, she couldn't shake the feeling that Thomas's disappearance wasn't coincidental. The way that impossibly detailed space had transformed before her eyes suggested forces at work beyond her understanding, and now the man at the center of it all had vanished without explanation. She made coffee with trembling hands, her mind racing through possibilities. Had someone taken him? Had he left willingly? Or worse, had her discovery of the treehouse's secrets somehow triggered his departure? The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Elena found herself pacing between the kitchen window and the front door, watching for any sign of movement in the forest. She tried to occupy herself with household tasks, but her attention kept drifting to the workshop where the miniature treehouse waited on its table. By afternoon, her worry had crystallized into determination. If Thomas wouldn't provide answers, she would find them herself. The workshop felt different in daylight, less mysterious but somehow more urgent. Elena approached the miniature treehouse with careful steps, noting details she'd missed in her nighttime exploration. The craftsmanship was even more extraordinary than she'd initially realized. Every tiny shingle, each miniature window frame, bore the marks of obsessive attention to detail. Nothing happened. She waited several more minutes, growing increasingly frustrated. Had she imagined the entire experience? The memory felt vivid and real, but in the harsh light of day, it seemed impossible that she'd actually watched the room reshape itself into an entirely different space. Elena was about to close the panel when a faint sound reached her ears, voices carrying on the wind from somewhere deep in the forest. Her heart leaped with hope that Thomas had returned, but as she listened more carefully, she realized the voices belonged to strangers. Moving to the workshop window, she peered through the trees and spotted movement perhaps a quarter-mile away. 3 men in dark clothing were making their way through the forest with purposeful strides, clearly searching for something or someone. Elena's blood ran cold. These weren't casual hikers or lost travelers. Something about their bearing and the coordinated way they moved through the undergrowth suggested a more serious purpose. One of them paused to examine something on the ground. Tracks, she realized with growing alarm. Thomas's tracks. Without conscious thought, Elena found herself moving toward the cabin's back door. If these men were following her husband's trail, she needed to warn him. The rational part of her mind protested that she had no idea where he'd gone or how to find him, but her feet carried her forward anyway. The forest enveloped her in its familiar embrace of shadows and whispered secrets. Elena had spent enough time wandering these woods over the past weeks to feel comfortable navigating the maze of trails, though she'd never ventured this far from the cabin alone. She moved as quietly as possible, following what she hoped was the same path Thomas had taken. The voices of the pursuing men faded behind her, but Elena knew they couldn't be far away. Every snapping twig beneath her feet sounded impossibly loud. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she pressed deeper into the forest, following signs that might or might not indicate Thomas's passage. A broken branch here, disturbed leaves there. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, Elena emerged into a small clearing she'd never seen before. Ancient trees formed a perfect circle around a space where sunlight fell in golden columns. The air itself seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly quality that reminded her uncomfortably of the miniature room's transformation. Thomas stood in the center of the clearing with his back to her, but he wasn't alone. A woman Elena had never seen before faced him across the sun-dappled space. She was tall and elegant, with silver-streaked hair and clothing that seemed to blend seamlessly with the forest around her. Though Elena couldn't make out their words, the intensity of their conversation was unmistakable. Elena crept closer, using the massive trunk of an oak tree for concealment. As she strained to listen, fragments of their discussion reached her ears, words that made her question everything she thought she knew about her mysterious husband and the life she'd stumbled into. The morning after discovering the hidden room, Clara woke to find Elias already gone. His side of the bed was cold, suggesting he'd left before dawn. She dressed quickly and made her way downstairs, where a simple breakfast waited on the kitchen table alongside a hastily scrawled note, "Called away on ranger business. Back by evening. E." Clara stared at the note, her mind racing with questions from the night before. The miniature treehouse sat innocently on the mantelpiece, but now she knew it was anything but innocent. Those tiny, intricate mechanisms weren't the work of a simple forest ranger. The precision, the craftsmanship, the impossible detail, it spoke of training and knowledge far beyond what Elias had revealed about himself. She spent the morning pacing the cabin, her thoughts churning. Every corner seemed to hold new significance now. The perfectly fitted joints in the wooden walls, the ingenious design of the water pump, even the way the windows were positioned to capture maximum light while remaining inconspicuous from outside. Everything suggested a man skilled in far more than tracking deer and maintaining trails. By afternoon, restlessness drove her outdoors. She followed the path Elias typically took into the deeper woods, hoping to find some clue about where he'd gone. The forest felt different today, alive with whispers and shadows that hadn't seemed significant before. Every broken branch, every disturbed patch of earth might mean something. 20 minutes into her walk, she heard voices. Clara stepped off the path, crouching behind a massive oak, as two men in worn traveling clothes emerged from a thicket ahead. They moved with purpose, scanning the trees with sharp, calculating eyes that reminded her uncomfortably of hunting hawks. "Still no sign of him," the taller one said, his accent unfamiliar. "Not from the local villages. 3 weeks we've been searching these woods." "He's here," his companion replied with certainty. "The clockmaker's daughter confirmed it before she died. Said she gave him the final piece herself." Clara's breath caught. They were looking for Elias. But why? And what did they mean about a clockmaker's daughter? Maybe we should try the settlements again. Question the locals more thoroughly. The shorter man shook his head. "No, that would draw attention we can't afford. The guild wants this handled quietly. If word gets out that he's still alive, still building those devices..." The marriage was clever, I'll give him that. Who'd look for the shadow artificer among simple forest folk? Shadow artificer. The word sent ice through Clara's veins. She'd heard that title whispered in the capital, always with fear and awe. The shadow artificer was a legend, a master craftsman who could build impossible things, mechanical wonders that defied natural law. But the stories also said he'd vanished years ago, after creating something that had terrified even the Guild of Engineers. The men moved on, their voices fading into the forest's ambient sounds. Clara remained frozen behind the oak, her world reshaping itself around this revelation. Elias wasn't just hiding a talent for woodworking. He was one of the most sought-after minds in the kingdom, apparently, hunted by people who spoke casually of death and torture. She thought of the miniature treehouse with new understanding. Those weren't just clever mechanisms. They were the work of a master artificer, each tiny gear and spring a testament to skills that could reshape the world itself. And he'd given it to her as a wedding gift, trusting her with evidence of his true identity without even knowing if she could be trusted. The weight of that trust settled on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. Elias had married her not just to satisfy their family's arrangement, but as part of an elaborate disguise. Yet instead of treating her as merely a convenient cover, he'd shared his greatest secret. The question was why. Clara made her way back to the cabin, her mind buzzing with implications. If those men were right about the guild hunting him, then she and Elias were both in danger. But she also realized something else. This explained the sadness she sometimes glimpsed in his eyes, the careful way he spoke about his past. He wasn't just a man hiding in the woods, he was a man who'd lost everything and was trying to build something new. As evening approached, she prepared dinner and waited, the miniature treehouse seeming to pulse with significance on the mantelpiece. When she finally heard Elias's footsteps on the porch, her heart hammered against her ribs. He entered quietly, hanging his ranger's cloak on its usual peg. His eyes found hers immediately, and she saw exhaustion there, along with something that might have been relief. "How was your day?" he asked, the question carrying weight beyond casual conversation. Clara looked at him, really looked, seeing past the simple clothes and weathered hands to the brilliant mind beneath. "Enlightening," she said carefully. "We need to talk." Something shifted in his expression, a resignation mixed with hope. "Yes," he said quietly. "I believe we do." The morning light filtered through the cottage windows as Elena sat at the kitchen table, turning the tiny golden key over in her fingers. 3 days had passed since she'd discovered it hidden in the miniature treehouse's smallest room, and she still hadn't found what it unlocked. Every surface, every drawer, every possible hiding place in the real treehouse had been searched, yet the key's purpose remained elusive. Thomas entered carrying firewood, his movements careful around his still-healing shoulder. She quickly closed her fist around the key, but not before he noticed her startled gesture. "You've been restless lately," he observed, setting the wood by the hearth. "Something troubling you?" Elena studied his face, searching for any hint of deception. His expression remained open, concerned, but she'd learned that Thomas was skilled at concealing his thoughts. I keep thinking about what happened, about why those men came here. The authorities will handle it. His tone carried a finality that discouraged further questions, but Elena persisted. You said they were after something. What could we possibly have that anyone would want badly enough to break in for? Thomas sat across from her, wincing slightly as he favored his injured arm. Sometimes men do desperate things for money. They probably thought a ranger's cabin would be an easy target. The explanation felt rehearsed, hollow. Elena had grown skilled at recognizing when her husband was deflecting. Thomas, I need you to be honest with me. Are we in danger? For a long moment he was silent. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. I've tried to leave certain parts of my past behind, but the past has a way of following us, whether we want it to or not. What parts? What aren't you telling me? Before he could answer, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Thomas's entire body tensed, his hand instinctively moving to where Elena knew he kept a knife concealed. Through the window she saw two riders approaching, a woman in elegant traveling clothes and a man in a dark coat. Stay inside, Thomas said, already moving toward the door. Thomas, wait! But he was already stepping onto the porch. Elena pressed herself against the window, straining to hear their conversation. The woman dismounted gracefully, her auburn hair pinned in an elaborate style that spoke of city sophistication. She was beautiful in a way that made Elena suddenly conscious of her own simple dress and unadorned hair. "Hello, Marcus," the woman said, and Elena's blood chilled. The name hung in the air like an accusation. Thomas, Marcus, stood rigid. "Victoria, you shouldn't have come here." "Shouldn't I?" "When my fiancé disappears without a word, leaving only rumors and whispers behind." Victoria's voice carried across the clearing, each word precise and cutting. "Did you really think you could simply vanish and start a new life?" Elena's mind reeled. "Fiancé?" The tiny key bit into her palm as her fist clenched involuntarily. "That engagement was your father's arrangement, not mine," Thomas replied. "I made my position clear before I left. Before you stole the Meridian collection and fled like a common thief, you mean?" The words hit Elena like a physical blow. She sank into the chair, her legs suddenly unsteady. The Meridian collection, she'd heard whispers of it in her father's house. Ancient artifacts worth more than most people saw in a lifetime. "I stole nothing that wasn't already mine by right," Thomas said, his voice deadly quiet. Victoria laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Your grandfather's work belongs to the university. You know this. Return what you took and perhaps we can discuss your current situation, like civilized people." Elena forced herself to move closer to the window. The man with Victoria had dismounted as well, and she could see the bulge of a weapon beneath his coat. "I won't ask again, Marcus. Where is the collection?" "Gone," Thomas said simply. "Sold, scattered, lost. There's nothing left to find." But Elena knew he was lying. The impossible intricacy of the miniature treehouse, the strange symbols carved throughout their real treehouse, the way he'd known exactly where to hide when the intruders came, it all pointed to secrets still kept, treasures still hidden. Her fingers traced the golden key's surface, and suddenly she understood. Not a key to open something, but to unlock something that was already here, hidden in plain sight among the impossibly detailed miniatures she'd been admiring for weeks. Victoria remounted her horse with fluid grace. "You've changed, Marcus. Marriage to a provincial girl has made you domestic. But don't think this isolation will protect you forever. Others are looking for you, others who won't be as patient as I've been." As the riders departed, Elena remained frozen by the window. Thomas, Marcus, stood on the porch long after they'd disappeared, his shoulders bearing the weight of revelations she was only beginning to understand. When he finally turned back toward the cottage, she saw a stranger's face beneath familiar features and realized that her mysterious husband's secrets ran deeper than she'd ever imagined. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the forest glistening with dewdrops that caught the early sunlight like scattered diamonds. Elena woke to find Kieran already gone, his side of the bed cold to the touch. She'd grown accustomed to his early departures, but today something felt different, urgent. She found a note on the kitchen table, written in his careful script, gone to check the eastern boundary, back by evening, stay close to the house today. The warning, those final words, made her stomach tighten. She moved to the window and peered through the curtains at the tree line. Everything appeared normal, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that invisible eyes were watching from the shadows between the pines. By midday, her restlessness had become unbearable. She found herself drawn to the treehouse, climbing the rope ladder with practiced ease. The miniature structure seemed to hum with energy today, its tiny windows glowing more brightly than usual. As she settled cross-legged on the platform, the dollhouse began its familiar transformation. But instead of revealing new rooms or corridors, the walls became transparent, like looking through clear glass. Elena gasped as she realized she was seeing through Kieran's eyes, experiencing his world as if she were walking beside him through the dense forest. He moved with purpose through terrain she'd never seen before, following an old deer path that led deeper into the wilderness than she'd imagined possible. His breathing was controlled but tense, and occasionally he would pause to examine broken branches or disturbed earth. He was tracking something. The vision shifted, and Elena found herself experiencing a memory from years past. A younger Kieran stood in what appeared to be an elegant study, facing a woman with sharp cheekbones and silver hair pulled back severely. The woman's voice carried the weight of authority and barely concealed frustration. "You cannot simply disappear, Kieran. Your responsibilities—" "My responsibilities are here now," he interrupted, his voice carrying a steel Elena had never heard before. "I've given you everything I can. Let that be enough. The council will not accept. The council will have to." He turned toward a window that looked out over a city skyline Elena didn't recognize. "I'm done with their games, Mother. I'm done with all of it." The scene dissolved, replaced by another memory. Kieran sat at a workbench in what she recognized as his workshop, but years younger, crafting something with meticulous care. His hands moved with the same gentle precision she'd observed countless times, but his expression held a desperate intensity. "Please work," he whispered to the object in his hands, a small, intricate compass that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. "Let me find her before they do." Elena's breath caught as she realized he was speaking about her. But how could he have been searching for her before they'd ever met? Before the marriage had even been arranged? The visions abruptly ceased as the sound of approaching vehicles shattered the forest quiet. Elena scrambled down from the treehouse and ran to the front window. 3 black SUVs were making their way up the dirt road, moving slowly but deliberately. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she remembered Kieran's warning to stay close to the house. The vehicles stopped at the edge of their clearing, and several figures emerged. They wore dark suits that seemed absurdly formal for the wilderness setting, and they moved with the coordinated precision of a military unit. The woman who appeared to be their leader had silver hair and sharp features that seemed familiar. Elena ducked below the windowsill as the woman's gaze swept across the cabin. She was the same person from Kieran's memory, his mother. But what was she doing here, and why did her presence fill Elena with such dread? A firm knock echoed through the cabin. "Mrs. Blackwood," the woman called, her voice carrying clearly through the door. "I know you're inside. We simply want to talk." Elena pressed her back against the wall, mind racing. How did this woman know she was here? And why did she use that formal tone, as if they were strangers when she'd just seen evidence that this was Kieran's mother? "There's no need to be afraid," the woman continued. "We're here about your husband's inheritance. There are matters that require immediate attention." The word inheritance sent a chill through Elena. In the memories she'd witnessed, there had been talk of responsibilities, of a council, of duties Kieran had tried to abandon. Whatever world he'd left behind, it had apparently come looking for him. Footsteps circled the cabin, and Elena realized with growing panic that they weren't just going to wait for her to answer. Through the back window, she could see two figures examining the workshop, while another headed directly toward the treehouse. She had to warn Kieran, but how? The miniature treehouse might hold the answer, but she'd need time to figure out how to use it, time she might not have. The front door handle turned slowly, testing whether it was locked. The storm that had been brewing all week finally broke, just as Elena reached the old oak where she'd first discovered Marcus's workshop. Rain lashed through the canopy, turning the forest floor treacherous with mud and fallen leaves. She pressed herself against the massive trunk, catching her breath while lightning illuminated the woods in stark silver snapshots. She'd been following the strange symbols carved into trees for 3 days now, each one leading deeper into the wilderness than she'd ever ventured. The miniature treehouse sat heavy in her satchel, its tiny mechanism still clicking softly despite the dampness. Every time she'd tried to confront Marcus about what she'd learned from Thomas Blackwood, he'd found an excuse to disappear into the forest on ranger business. But tonight, she'd seen him leave the cabin with a leather case she'd never noticed before, moving with the purposeful stride of a man with urgent business. Against every instinct screaming at her to stay warm and dry, she'd followed. Thunder rolled overhead as she spotted a flicker of lantern light through the trees ahead. Elena pushed away from the oak and crept forward, her boots squelching in the saturated earth. The light came from a clearing she'd never seen before, despite months of exploring these woods. As she drew closer, she could make out the silhouette of a structure that definitely hadn't been there before, or had been so well hidden that it might as well have been invisible. It was a cabin, but not like any she'd ever seen. The walls seemed to shift and blend with the surrounding trees, as if the building itself were more suggestion than solid architecture. Windows glowed warmly from within, but their placement defied logic, appearing at angles that should have been impossible given the structure's apparent size. Elena crouched behind a fallen log, rain streaming down her face as she watched Marcus emerge from the cabin's front door. He moved differently here, more fluid, more confident. In his hands he carried what looked like another miniature treehouse, this one glowing with the same soft phosphorescence she'd noticed in her wedding gift. "I know you're there, Elena." His voice carried clearly despite the storm, and she felt her heart stop. Slowly she rose from her hiding place, water dripping from her soaked hair. "How long have you known I was following you?" Marcus turned to face her, and even in the dim lantern light, she could see something had changed in his expression. The careful reserve he always wore had fallen away, revealing something ancient and weary beneath. "Since the second day. You're getting better at moving quietly, but you still favor your left foot when you're nervous." He gestured toward the impossible cabin. "You might as well come inside. We have a great deal to discuss." The interior of the cabin made even less sense than the exterior. Rooms opened into other rooms that shouldn't have fit within the walls she'd observed from outside. Shelves lined every available surface, filled with hundreds of miniature structures. Not just tree houses, but entire cities in perfect detail. Some were made of wood and stone, others of materials she couldn't identify that seemed to shift between states of matter as she watched. "Sit down before you fall down," Marcus said, settling into a chair beside a fireplace that crackled with flames that cast no smoke. "And take that treehouse out of your bag. It's probably very uncomfortable being carried around while it's active." Elena's hands trembled as she withdrew the miniature treehouse. The moment it left her satchel, the tiny windows blazed brighter, and she could swear she heard microscopic voices singing. "What are they?" she whispered. "Doorways," Marcus replied simply. "Each one opens to a different place, a different possibility. The one I gave you connects to a realm where the libraries hold all the knowledge that was ever lost, where scholars who died before their time continue their work." He gestured to the shelves around them. "I've been building them for longer than you might think possible." "How long?" "I stopped counting after the 3rd century." Elena stared at him, searching his face for any sign that he was joking. She found none. "That's impossible." "So is a treehouse with working lights, powered by nothing visible. So is a cabin that's bigger inside than outside. So is falling in love with someone who was supposed to be nothing more than a convenient solution to a debt." His voice softened on the last words, and Elena felt something shift in her chest. The marriage wasn't just about my father's gambling debts, was it? Marcus shook his head slowly. Thomas Blackwood knows what I am. He's known for years. He needed someone he could trust to keep an eye on me. Someone who wouldn't be corrupted by what I can offer. And what do you offer? Marcus stood and moved to one of the shelves, lifting down a miniature castle that seemed to be made of crystallized moonlight. Anything, everything, every world that ever was or could be, every story that was never told, every life that was never lived. He turned back to her, his eyes reflecting depths she was only beginning to understand. The question is, what do you want, Elena? Because I can give it to you. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the impossible cabin, Elena felt as though she stood at the threshold of something far more vast and dangerous than weather. The storm that had been brewing all day finally broke as Elena made her way through the darkening forest, rain pelting the canopy above in rhythmic torrents. She clutched the leather satchel containing the treehouse closer to her chest, its weight somehow both comforting and terrifying. The miniature structure had revealed more secrets since Marcus's confession about his true identity. Tiny drawers had appeared overnight, each containing maps marked with locations she didn't recognize and symbols that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. Thunder rumbled overhead as she reached the clearing where Marcus had told her to meet him. He stood beneath an ancient oak, its massive trunk scarred with what looked like claw marks, though no bear she knew of could reach that high. Water dripped from his dark hair, and in the intermittent lightning, his face appeared haggard, older than his 30 years. "You came," he said, his voice barely audible above the storm. "Did I have a choice?" Elena stepped closer, noting how his hand rested on the pommel of a knife she'd never seen him carry before. "After what you showed me in that treehouse, the real treehouse, I think I deserve answers." Marcus winced. 3 days ago, he had led her deep into the forest to a clearing where an impossible structure grew from the living wood of 7 intertwined trees. It had been beautiful and terrifying, with rooms that defied geometry and windows that showed glimpses of places that couldn't exist. Inside, she had seen books written in languages that hurt to read, artifacts that hummed with their own energy, and portraits of people who looked exactly like her and Marcus, but dressed in clothing from centuries past. "The Hartwell family has been the guardians of this forest for over 300 years, he began, his eyes scanning the tree line, as if expecting unwelcome visitors. "We protect something that most people would call impossible. A threshold between worlds. The treehouse you saw, the miniature I gave you, they're both keys and locks simultaneously." A branch snapped somewhere in the darkness beyond the clearing. Marcus's hand tightened on his weapon, and Elena felt her pulse quicken. Keys to what? Passages, doorways, places where our world touches others. Lightning illuminated his face, revealing the strain etched in every line. "Your family, the Ashfords, have been the other half of this guardianship. The marriage wasn't just arranged by our parents, Elena, it was written into the very fabric of the forest itself, generations ago." Elena's breath caught. She thought of her grandmother's stories, dismissed as folklore, tales of women in their family who could speak to trees, who knew secret paths through any forest, who could find their way home from impossible distances. "That's why you seemed familiar when we first met, why touching you felt like remembering something I'd forgotten." "Yes." Marcus stepped closer, and she could see the relief in his eyes that she understood. "But something's gone wrong. The barriers are weakening, and things are crossing over that shouldn't be here. That's why I've been gone so much, why I've seemed distant. I've been trying to repair the damage, but I can't do it alone." Another crack in the underbrush, closer this time. Elena turned toward the sound and froze. Something moved between the trees, tall, wrong somehow, with limbs that bent at unnatural angles. Its eyes reflected the lightning like coins. "Don't look directly at it," Marcus whispered, drawing his blade in one smooth motion. The metal gleamed with its own light, inscribed with symbols that matched those in the treehouse. "It's already partially here because the threshold is compromised." Elena felt the miniature treehouse grow warm in her hands. She looked down to see tiny windows glowing like stars, and suddenly she understood. The treehouse, it's not just a replica, is it? It's a focus, a way to channel whatever ability I inherited. Your grandmother never told you how to use it? She died when I was 12. Elena closed her eyes, trying to remember fragments of half-understood lessons. But she used to say that our family were the roots, and yours were the branches, and together we make the tree complete. Marcus moved to stand beside her, his free hand finding hers. Elena, I need you to trust me. Trust the part of you that knows this forest like you know your own heartbeat. The thing in the trees stepped into the clearing, and Elena's breath hitched. It stood nearly 8 feet tall, its limbs too long for its torso, its face a shifting shadow that hurt to perceive. When it spoke, its voice sounded like wind through dead leaves. The doors are opening, the compact weakens, soon all barriers will fall. Elena felt power flowing through her, ancient and deep as tree roots. The miniature treehouse pulsed with warm light, and suddenly she could sense the network of connections threading through the forest. Every tree, every root, every living thing linked in an intricate pattern that she and Marcus stood at the center of. Not today, she said, her voice stronger than she felt, and stepped forward to meet whatever came next. The storm had passed, leaving the forest crystalline and strange in the aftermath. Elena walked beside Marcus through the dripping undergrowth, her hand occasionally brushing his as they navigated fallen branches and pools of rainwater that reflected the sky like scattered mirrors. The miniature treehouse sat carefully wrapped in her satchel, its secrets now shared between them, like a bridge built of trust and wonder. "There's something I need to show you," Marcus said, his voice carrying an edge of nervousness she'd rarely heard. "Something I should have shown you weeks ago." They emerged into a clearing Elena had never seen before, though she thought she'd explored every inch of their land. Ancient oaks formed a perfect circle around a space that hummed with the same energy she'd felt emanating from the treehouse. But it was what stood in the center that made her breath catch. A workshop, but not like any she could have imagined. The building seemed to grow from the earth itself, its walls a living fusion of stone and wood, and something that might have been starlight captured in crystal. Vines heavy with impossible flowers, blooms that shifted color as she watched, wound around windows that gleamed like captured aurora. "Marcus," she whispered, reaching for his hand without thinking. "What is this place?" He squeezed her fingers, drawing strength from the contact. "My real work. What I was doing before the marriage was arranged, what I've been doing since, what I'll be doing for the rest of my life, if they let me." The door opened at his touch, though Elena saw no handle, no mechanism. Inside, the space defied the modest exterior dimensions. Workbenches stretched in impossible directions, covered with tools that seemed forged from moonbeams and morning mist. Half-finished creations lined the walls, a music box that played memories, a compass that pointed toward lost things, a mirror that showed not reflections but dreams. "The treehouse was the smallest thing I've ever made," Marcus said, watching her wonder with careful eyes. "Usually the council commissions larger works, bridges between worlds, doors that open onto yesterday, things that shape the boundary between what is and what could be." Elena moved through the space like a sleepwalker, her fingers trailing over surfaces that felt warm and alive. The council, the same one that arranged our marriage. They needed me anchored, bound to this place by something stronger than duty. His voice grew quiet. "They chose you because they thought you were ordinary, safe, someone who would never question or understand." She turned to face him, something fierce blazing in her chest. "They were wrong about me." "Yes," he said, and his smile was like sunrise after the longest night, spectacularly wrong. A soft chime filled the air, and Marcus's expression shifted to alertness. On one of the workbenches, a crystal sphere pulsed with urgent light. He moved to it quickly, his hands dancing over its surface in patterns Elena couldn't follow. "What is it?" "A message from the council." His face darkened as symbols appeared in the crystal's depths. "They're coming. Tonight." "Is that bad?" Marcus was already moving, gathering tools and materials with practiced efficiency. They want to see you, to assess whether you're suitable to know what you now know. Elena felt ice form in her stomach. And if they decide I'm not? He stopped, his hands stilling on a device that looked like a compass made of captured lightning. They have ways of making people forget, of unweaving memories like they're pulling threads from cloth. The thought of losing this, losing the wonder, the magic, the truth of who Marcus really was, sent panic racing through her veins. No, I won't let them. Elena, you don't understand. These people, they're not entirely human anymore. The magic changes you, and they've been working with it for centuries. They have power you can't imagine. She moved to him, taking his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. Then teach me. Show me how to fight them. There's no time. There's always time for the impossible, she said, echoing the words he'd spoken to her that first day with the treehouse. You taught me that. For a moment, Marcus stared at her, and she saw something shift in his expression. Recognition, perhaps, or hope. The treehouse. You still have it? Elena nodded, patting her satchel. It chose you before I did, before the council did. That has to mean something. He moved to a cabinet that opened like a flower, revealing rows of bottles filled with liquid starlight. If you're willing to risk everything, there might be a way. But Elena, if we do this, there's no going back. You'll be changed. Part of this world in a way that can never be undone. Through the crystal windows, Elena could see lights moving between the trees. Not the warm glow of lanterns, but something colder and more deliberate. The council was coming, and with them the power to steal away everything she'd discovered. She thought of the life she'd expected, quiet, ordinary, safe. Then she looked around the workshop, at the man she'd married who crafted wonders from dreams, and knew there was only one choice she could live with. "Show me," she said. The morning sun filtered through the cabin windows as Elena packed the last of their supplies into a worn leather satchel. 3 days had passed since Marcus revealed the truth about the Guardians, and every moment felt borrowed, precious and fleeting. She could see the tension in his shoulders as he checked the small arsenal of carved talismans he'd been crafting through sleepless nights. "They'll come through the eastern ridge," he said quietly, not looking up from his work. "The old growth there is dense enough to mask their approach, but it also means we'll have warning if we're positioned correctly." Elena nodded, though her stomach churned with anxiety. The miniature treehouse sat between them on the table, its tiny rooms now glowing with a soft amber light that pulsed like a heartbeat. Marcus had explained that it was responding to the approaching threat, but knowing this didn't make the sight less unnerving. "What if we're wrong?" she asked, voicing the fear that had been gnawing at her. "What if running only makes things worse?" Marcus finally looked at her, his green eyes soft but determined. "Then we'll face whatever comes together. But Elena, you have to understand, staying means certain death. At least this way we have a chance." A sharp knock at the door froze them both. Marcus's hand moved instinctively to the knife at his belt, but Elena was already moving toward the window. Through the glass, she saw a familiar figure in a ranger's uniform. "It's James," she whispered, relief flooding through her. Marcus opened the door cautiously. James Hoffman stepped inside, his usually cheerful demeanor replaced by grim urgency. "We need to talk, all of us." "James, I can explain," Marcus began. "No need." James held up a weathered photograph. In it, a younger man who looked remarkably like Marcus stood beside Elena's grandmother, both wearing clothes from decades past. "Your grandfather wasn't the only one with secrets, Marcus. My family's been protecting yours for 3 generations. Elena stared at the photograph, her grandmother's young face bringing tears to her eyes. She knew everything when she arranged our marriage." James nodded grimly. "The Hoffman family has served as a buffer between the Guardians and the outside world for 60 years. We've been feeding them false information, misdirecting their searches. But yesterday, everything changed." He pulled out a radio, its antenna crackling with static. "They're not coming from the eastern ridge. They're already here, scattered throughout the town. The marriage records, the property transfers, even your grandmother's death. It was all part of drawing you both into the open. Marcus cursed under his breath. How many? At least a dozen, maybe more. They've been posing as tourists, traveling salesmen, even a new deputy sheriff. The net's been closing for weeks. Elena felt the walls of the cabin pressing in on her. Then we're trapped. Not necessarily. James moved to the window, peering through the curtains. There's an old mining tunnel system that runs beneath the forest. Your grandfather used it during the war when the first Guardians came looking. The entrance is hidden behind the waterfall where you first showed Elena the carved symbols. Marcus was already moving, gathering their supplies. How long do we have? They're planning to move at sunset. Apparently, they believe the treehouse's power is strongest at twilight. James glanced at the miniature structure, its glow now noticeably brighter. They're not wrong, are they? No, Marcus admitted. But that might work in our favor. If they're waiting for sunset, we have 6 hours to reach the tunnels. Elena carefully wrapped the treehouse in soft cloth, surprised by how warm it felt against her hands. As she secured it in the satchel, she felt a strange pulse of energy, as if the tiny structure was trying to communicate with her. Marcus, she said slowly, what if we're thinking about this wrong? What if, instead of running from the Guardians, we use what they want against them? Both men turned to her, confusion clear on their faces. The treehouse responds to intention, right? It showed me the truth about your family because I needed to understand. What if it could show the Guardians something they need to see? Marcus shook his head. Elena, it's too dangerous. We don't know how they might try to use its power. But we do know they've spent decades hunting for it, based on incomplete knowledge. They see it as a weapon, or a tool for control. Elena pulled the treehouse free from its wrapping, watching as its glow intensified in the afternoon light. What if it's actually something else entirely? James stepped closer, studying the intricate structure. Your grandmother mentioned something once, about choices and consequences. She said the forest remembers everything but forgives those who learn from their mistakes. As if responding to his words, the treehouse's amber glow shifted, showing brief glimpses of scenes within its tiny windows. Not memories this time, but possibilities. Elena saw herself and Marcus, older, standing together in a forest where sunlight and shadow danced in perfect harmony. We're not running, she said firmly. We're going to end this. The morning sun filtered through the cabin windows as Elena sat at the kitchen table, the miniature treehouse before her seeming almost ordinary in daylight. Almost. She traced her finger along its tiny railings, remembering the impossible visions it had shown her, glimpses of futures that shouldn't exist, memories that belonged to others. Marcus emerged from the bedroom, dark circles under his eyes suggesting he'd slept as poorly as she had. The events of the previous night hung between them like morning mist, heavy with unspoken truths. We need to talk, he said, pouring coffee with hands that trembled slightly. About the treehouse. About what I saw? Elena's voice was steady, but her heart hammered against her ribs. Or about who you really are? Marcus set down his cup so hard coffee sloshed onto the wooden table. Elena, there are things about my family, about this forest, that I should have told you sooner. But I was trying to protect you. From what? She stood, frustration finally boiling over. From the truth, from whatever strange power runs through your bloodline. I'm your wife, Marcus. I deserve to know what I've married into. Before he could answer, a sharp knock echoed through the cabin. They both froze, recognizing the authoritative rhythm. Marcus moved to the window and cursed under his breath. Sheriff Morrison. And he's not alone. Elena quickly covered the treehouse with a kitchen towel as Marcus opened the door. Sheriff Morrison stepped inside, followed by a tall woman in a crisp federal agent's uniform and Elena's father, whose face was grim with determination. "Morning, Marcus," Morrison said, his tone all business. "This is Agent Sarah Chen from the Department of Environmental Crimes. We need to ask you some questions." Elena's father pushed forward, his eyes scanning the cabin until they found her. "Elena, thank God. You're coming home with me. This charade has gone on long enough." "What's this about?" Marcus asked, though Elena noticed how his body had tensed, like an animal sensing a trap. Agent Chen pulled out a tablet, swiping to reveal photographs of the forest clearing where they'd been the night before. But these images showed something impossible. The trees were different, older, arranged in patterns that hadn't existed yesterday. "Satellite imagery from last week shows unusual changes in the forest vegetation under your jurisdiction," Chen said. "Changes that don't follow any known pattern of natural growth. The department has reason to believe illegal genetic modification of plant life is occurring on federal land." Elena felt the blood drain from her face. The visions from the treehouse rushed back, images of trees growing and changing, of the forest responding to some unseen force. Had Marcus somehow caused those changes? "I monitor this forest every day," Marcus said carefully. "Any changes would be in my reports." "Would they?" Elena's father stepped closer, his voice sharp with accusation. "Or would you cover them up, just like you've covered up whatever strange hold you have over my daughter?" The towel-covered treehouse seemed to pulse with hidden energy, and Elena found herself moving protectively toward it. "Father, you don't understand." "I understand that you've been isolated here, confused by whatever spell this man has woven around you." Her father's eyes were wild with desperate concern. "Elena, Mrs. Hartwell told me about the lights people have seen in the forest, the way animals behave strangely around your husband. This isn't natural." Agent Chen's attention sharpened. "What kind of lights?" Morrison shifted uncomfortably. "There have been reports of unusual phenomena in this sector, lights moving through the trees, plants growing overnight. I figured it was just local superstition, but now you're wondering if there's truth to the stories," Chen finished. She turned to Marcus, her gaze calculating. "Mr. Thorne, we're going to need you to accompany us for questioning, and we'll be conducting a full investigation of your property." Elena felt panic rise in her throat. If they searched the cabin, they'd find the treehouse. They'd want to study it, dissect whatever magic it contained. She couldn't let that happen. "There's something you should know," she said, surprising everyone, including herself. Marcus shot her a warning look, but she pressed on. "My husband isn't hiding anything illegal, but this forest, it's not like other places. There are things here that science can't easily explain." Her father laughed bitterly. "Listen to yourself, Elena. He has you defending the impossible. What if the impossible is simply what we don't understand yet?" Elena moved closer to Marcus, feeling the solid warmth of him beside her. "What if there are forces in this world that exist beyond our current knowledge?" Agent Chen's expression had grown skeptical, but Elena caught something else in her eyes. A flicker of curiosity, perhaps even recognition. "Mrs. Thorne," Chen said slowly, "exactly what kind of forces are we talking about?" Elena looked at Marcus, seeing in his dark eyes both fear and a strange kind of pride. The choice was hers now, reveal their secrets or lose him to suspicion and investigation. The treehouse pulsed beneath its covering, waiting. The storm that had been threatening all evening finally broke, as Elena stood in the clearing where she'd first discovered Thomas's workshop. Rain pelted through the canopy above, but she barely felt it. Her hands trembled as she held the final piece of the puzzle, a letter her father had hidden in his desk, one she'd found only hours ago while searching for documents related to the family's debts. "And my dearest Elena," the letter began in her father's familiar handwriting, "if you are reading this, then the arrangement has been made and you know the truth about your husband. Thomas Blackwood is not who the village believes him to be, just as our family's troubles run deeper than simple financial hardship." Lightning illuminated the trees around her as she continued reading, her heart pounding with each revelation. Her father had known about Thomas's true identity all along, had known he was the heir to the Blackwood fortune, the son who had disappeared from high society years ago to live in self-imposed exile. But more shocking still was what came next. "The miniature treehouse was not just a wedding gift," the letter continued, "and it was a key, both literal and figurative. Your mother left something for you, hidden away before her death, something that certain people would kill for. Thomas agreed to this marriage not for land or money, but to protect you from those who would use you to find what she left behind. Elena's breath caught as the pieces suddenly aligned. Her mother's mysterious death when Elena was barely 10 years old. The strange men who had occasionally visited their estate, asking pointed questions about her mother's belongings. Her father's growing paranoia in recent years. His insistence that Elena learn to defend herself, to be self-reliant. The sound of footsteps on wet leaves made her spin around. Thomas emerged from the shadows between the trees, his dark hair plastered to his forehead by the rain. In his hand he carried a lantern that cast dancing shadows across his face. "You found it," he said quietly, nodding toward the letter in her hands. "It wasn't a question." "How long have you known I was here?" Elena asked, her voice barely audible above the storm. "Since you left the house an hour ago." He moved closer, setting the lantern on a fallen log. "Elena, I can explain." "Can you?" She held up the letter, rain beginning to blur the ink. "Because according to this, everything, our marriage, your presence here, even your identity, it's all been an elaborate lie to protect me from something I don't even understand." Thomas's jaw tightened. "Not everything was a lie." "Then tell me what's real." The words came out fiercer than she'd intended. "Tell me why my mother's death wasn't an accident. Tell me what she left behind that's worth arranging your entire life around a stranger." For a long moment, the only sound was rain pattering against leaves. Then Thomas reached into his coat and withdrew something small and metallic, a key that looked exactly like one of the tiny mechanisms from the miniature treehouse. "Your mother was a cryptographer during the war," he said finally. "She helped decode enemy messages, but she also discovered something else, evidence of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government, people who profited from prolonging the conflict, who sold secrets to both sides." Elena felt the world shift beneath her feet. Her gentle, soft-spoken mother, who had taught her to press flowers and braid her hair, had been a spy. She hid the evidence, Thomas continued, created an elaborate puzzle to protect it. The miniature treehouse contains a map, but only when combined with this key and something else, something only you would know how to find. "That's why you learned woodworking," Elena whispered, understanding flooding through her. "Why you taught yourself to create those intricate mechanisms. You've been preparing for this." "My father was one of the men your mother was investigating. The admission seemed to cost him something. When I discovered the truth about what he'd done, about the people he'd betrayed, I knew I had to make it right. Your father approached me 3 years ago, desperate to protect you from the same people who had killed your mother when they realized what she knew." Lightning flashed again, and in that brief moment of illumination, Elena saw something in Thomas's face she'd never noticed before. A deep, bone-weary exhaustion that spoke of carrying terrible secrets for far too long. "And the feelings between us?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. "Were those part of the deception too?" Thomas stepped closer, close enough that she could see the rain droplets on his eyelashes, the way his chest rose and fell with careful breathing. "That was the one thing I never planned for," he said softly. "The one thing that complicated everything, because somewhere between protecting you and living this lie, I fell in love with my own wife." The storm raged around them, but Elena felt perfectly still, balanced on the edge of a precipice that would change everything. The dawn light filtered through the cabin windows as Elena carefully placed the miniature treehouse back on its shelf. Her fingers lingered on the tiny carved railing where she'd first discovered the impossible world within, a world that had led her to uncover the conspiracy, threatening the Whispering Grove, and more importantly, to find love where she'd never expected it. Thomas emerged from the kitchen, carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee, his dark hair still tousled from sleep. 3 weeks had passed since they'd exposed Senator Blackwood's illegal logging operation and corrupt land deals. The arrests had made headlines across the state, but here in their sanctuary among the ancient trees, life had settled into something resembling peace. "The maple syrup harvest reports came in," Thomas said, settling beside her on the worn leather couch. "Production is up 30% from last year. The grove is healing faster than anyone anticipated. Elena accepted the coffee gratefully, breathing in the familiar scent of the forest that seemed to permeate everything in their home. Mrs. Chen stopped by yesterday while you were out checking the eastern boundary. She wanted me to give you this. She handed him a letter bearing the official seal of the State Environmental Protection Agency. Thomas's expression grew serious as he read, but gradually his lips curved into a smile. They're designating the entire Whispering Grove as a protected wilderness area. Permanent protection, Elena. No one can touch these trees again. The relief that washed over her was profound. She thought of the towering oaks and maples, some over 3 centuries old, that would continue to stand long after they were gone. Their sacrifice, her arranged marriage that had become real love, his years of solitary guardianship, had meant something lasting. "There's more," Thomas continued, his voice growing softer. "They're offering me the position of head ranger for the entire protected zone. It would mean a real salary, a proper future here. But Elena, I need you to know, if you want to leave, if this life isn't what you dreamed of, I'll understand. The marriage contract your father signed is void now that Blackwood's crimes have been exposed. You're free to choose." Elena set down her coffee and turned to face him fully. Over the past months, she'd watched this man she'd initially feared reveal layers of depth and kindness she'd never imagined possible. He was brilliant enough to outwit corrupt politicians, gentle enough to nurse injured wildlife back to health, and brave enough to risk everything to protect what he loved. Somewhere along the way, she'd realized that what he loved now included her. "Do you remember what you told me about the trees?" she asked. "How they communicate through their roots, sharing nutrients and warnings, growing stronger together than they ever could alone." Thomas nodded, his dark eyes studying her face intently. "I used to think marriage was about becoming smaller, fitting into someone else's life until you disappeared. But that's not what happened here. Being with you made me discover parts of myself I didn't know existed. I never knew I could be brave enough to break into government offices, or stubborn enough to stand up to armed men, or wise enough to solve puzzles that stumped everyone else." She reached for his hands, calloused from years of outdoor work, surprisingly gentle for their strength. "You asked if this life is what I dreamed of. Thomas, I never dreamed I could be this happy. I never dreamed I could be this myself." He pulled her closer, and she could see her reflection in his eyes, no longer the frightened girl who'd arrived here months ago, but a woman who'd found her place in the world. "The miniature treehouse," she said suddenly. "Where did it really come from?" Thomas smiled, that mysterious expression she'd learned to love. "My grandfather made it for my grandmother when they were courting. He was a master craftsman, worked for the old European aristocracy before coming to America. The hidden compartments, the secret mechanisms, he said every love story needed a little magic. And you gave it to me. I gave it to you, hoping that someday you might want to create our own love story, one with its own magic, its own secrets worth keeping." Elena leaned forward and kissed him, tasting coffee and morning and the promise of countless days ahead. When they broke apart, she rested her forehead against his. "I'll stay," she whispered. "Not because I have to, but because I choose to. Because this is home now." Outside their window, the Whispering Grove stretched endlessly in all directions, its ancient trees standing sentinel over the life they'd built together. The wind through the leaves sounded almost like music, like the forest itself was celebrating. Thomas stood and extended his hand to her. "Come on, Ranger's wife. We have a wilderness to protect." Elena took his hand and let him pull her to her feet, ready to face whatever adventures their new life might bring. In the distance, she could swear she heard the trees whispering their approval.